I was actually in the Lehman Brothers office making a pitch when people started throwing chairs out the door. And
The CEO was fired and forfeited over $40 million.
We didn't know it is becoming not a real good defense.
Boards, customers, regulators, they expect you to drive towards standardization.
But it's certainly measured in weeks and months and not, parts of a year. In terms of getting from the beginning to where you're already driving some value. So that's exciting for me.
5 years later, there's like a fraud inquiry. If I look at the benchmarks, there's about 60 to 70% of corporate investigation functions that are looking to improve themselves over the past year. So are we expecting like a cruise today, or are we going to be like in a Formula One car, kind of going from one end to the other of corporate investigations?
We're gonna go F1.
Today, we are going to have, for the next 45, 50 minutes, we're going to talk about corporate investigations and really thinking through what are the opportunities, what are the challenges that a corporate investigation department faces, and how do you capture that value from intake to reporting. Let's start with the introductions. I have with me Mirat. He is an experienced advisor. He's worked in-house, he's worked in consulting role in large companies. I would not do justice, Mirat.
Sure, thanks very much, Danish. Hi, all, Mirat Dave. I've worked with executives for corporate risk, legal, and compliance departments, including investigations, and really focus them on helping to maximize the value they deliver back to their organizations. A funny story I always like to tell is to think of your function like a pit crew in a car race. The driver is the face of the commercial side of the business that's competing in the market. And at some point, the driver needs to make a pit stop. In the business, that could be an investigation, consultation, a risk analysis. So just as the performance of the pit crew impacts the race outcome, I've always felt that the performance of investigation and other functions impacts the outcome of the business. So that's a lot of the work I do with companies, is how do you get aligned, how do you get speed, how do you get effectiveness and simplification to basically maximize the value delivered back to the organization. And I look forward to sharing some of the experiences, some things we've learned as we've gone on to try to drive towards standardization and automation and really creating a business case and value for companies.
Thanks, Rod. That's a great analogy. So are we expecting like a cruise today, or are we going to be like in a Formula One car?
We're going to go F1.
Going from one end to the other of corporate investigations. There we go. So Matt, you can be the navigator on this one. You can sit in the front seat.
Yeah, well, there's no one I'd rather ride shotgun with than Mirat. So thanks for having me. My name's Matt DenOuden. I'm from Onit, executive at Onit. Onit is a workflow and legal operations software tool. We have some 4,000 customers. I've been in the space now for 25 years, and throughout that time, almost every one of those years, I've been working with Hassan, who is the founder of Swiftwater. Before that, I was in private practice in the 80s and 90s, and my practice focused heavily on product liability and recurring litigation. And so I was usually hired by the product safety part of large manufacturers. And so while we were using almost no technology at the time, we were carrying around banker's boxes and yellow pads. The notion of managing claims proactively and doing it in close concert with the customer has been sort of in my blood for a long time. So really excited about this conversation today, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Matt. That was great. I've known Matt for probably 20 years now. I've been in the industry in different roles in different organizations, so we've crossed paths in different spaces. I'm Danish, but if you've seen me in other webinars or online, I've been working with the Office of General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for the last 20 years, really helping them achieve operational efficiency and effectiveness and helping their teams function at the top of their game. And as we go along, you're going to learn more about our Formula One days and how we help other organizations. But just a quick, I'm excited. The reason we are here today is that, as many of you know, Swiftwater is an amalgamation, an organization of expert advisors to the Office of General Counsel, Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Risk Officers, and the C-suite. And we help their teams achieve operational efficiency, fix challenges, become better business units within the broader business. And as we looked at the corporate compliance function, we kept coming across the same challenges and same problems. If I look at the benchmarks, there's about 60 to 70% of corporate investigation functions that are looking to improve themselves over the past years. There's about similar numbers that every top 3 list has improvement, some kind of operational improvement on the list of the leaders for these departments. So as we are advising organizations and the people and the process and the legal and the risk side of things, there's always this technology and process and data that comes in. And thankfully, we are there where we're to a point in 2025 where we can do something about it and go away from the patchwork of technology, the patchwork of data that exists in all different places in the enterprise. So we were excited. A few days ago, we announced this extension of our ongoing partnership with Onit that has expanded many more years than the name Swiftwater has existed with our experts. Matt, I'll pass the baton on to you. You've been a great part of this, and your team has been to help make this possible. What's your side of the story?
Yeah, it's really a customer story. Those are the only stories that matter as far as I'm concerned. And so many years back, we're fortunate enough to have a lot of the big pharmas as customers, a lot of FIs, a lot of technology companies who are subject to recurring claims. And one of these had been trying to implement a third-party investigation solution and was having not perfect success with it. And so together they pivoted and they were already an Onit matter management and e-billing customer, which is what we're often best known for. And so together we designed with Swiftwater our first generation investigation solution as sort of the antecedent to anything that might later become a matter, and to make sure that we close the whole loop of the investigation and after action. And so since that time, we've been fortunate enough that a number of other customers have been interested in that same offering. And together with Swiftwater, it's probably in generation 4, I would say, today. And we're pretty proud of it. If it's doing the right thing by our customers, that's heavily because of the influence like true subject matter experts such as Mirat. I might be a subject matter expert in ELM and matter management, but Mirat is the subject matter expert here, and along with Danish in investigations and in compliance. And so I'm really just here to celebrate this partnership and frankly the co-development of this solution. We're not here to show you the solution today, but we are proud of the fact that we're serving our customers together in this way.
Oh, it's exciting, Matt. I mean, thanks very much for everyone from your team and our Swiftwater team and getting this together and formalizing it. It takes a village to sort of make that kind of time investment and work investment to productize something. And as you said, today we might not show a demo, but I mean, let's tease it. Hopefully, by the end of it, everybody who's on the webinar can kind of say, hey, we were there. So raise your hands if you'd like to see more and learn more about the product. There's our Swiftwater Fearless Leader that kind of shows the joint effort that we put in together. It's just not a product, it's really a solution for the enterprise. So today's webinar, what's it going to be about? We're going to hear some exciting examples. We're going to hear some exciting challenges. I say exciting because they also are opportunities, hidden opportunities that the corporate investigations team can latch on, and now we have been able to solve these with new process technology, standardization. So the three takeaways we want everybody to take away from this conversation today that we put together is, how do we standardize and ensure consistency and create a global program for risk? And then to do that, and as we're doing it, how do we clearly convey the ROI of the investment to the enterprise, whether it's the board, whether it's the leadership, whether it's your team members, or even the employees that are involved. And then what kind of automation opportunities are there in today's world beyond just a ethics hotline notification that we can talk about that can really propel us towards that higher level of compliance, higher level of efficiency, and we go from there. I'm going to take a pause. So think about that and think about what we're going to do. Also, keep the comments going. Ask us questions, things that you think you're facing, or ask for a friend. We are happy to answer the questions, and we're a chatty bunch. If you're having trouble, the best way to kind of jump in, the best way is to put it in comments and keep it going. And with that, what I'm going to do is transition to Mirat and learn a little bit more about what are you seeing in the market in terms of opportunities, Mirat. I kind of created the hype, but what is really happening?
Sure, Danish, thank you very much. And, Matt said it, it's like, hey, customer stories and reality is always a great place to start. So I thought we'd reflect on a story that really puts a reality lens on our discussion. In the late 90s into the early 2000s, it was a time of exuberance. Some may have called it irrational exuberance. But a historically stable and conservative bank at the time experienced massive growth. They had set really aggressive cross-selling targets. Then we started seeing stories about bogus account openings. And over a 14-year period, employees had opened up multiple unauthorized products per household. So the question really is, why did that issue take so long to surface? In their case, customer complaints went to local branches or call centers. Employees that raised concerns or refused to participate, in some cases, were ignored, transferred, or even terminated. So crucially, at the center of this was that there was no single robust process to aggregate and investigate these similar complaints from across the banking network. Ultimately, the CEO was fired and forfeited over $40 million in compensation. They saw a 44% drop in consumer checking, 50% decline in new credit card applications. They paid $142 million in a class action settlement, paid another $480 million to shareholders, and if that wasn't enough, they paid $3 billion penalty as part of a deferred prosecution agreement. They even saw their stock price stagnate and it dropped 20% and then sort of stagnated throughout, until their consent decree was terminated in 2024. So, Danish, you talked about standardization, and that's sort of the premise of this is around unification and starting with standardization. And that sort of story, I hope, creates a pretty good business case for investing in unifying corporate investigations. And despite that, we know that getting funding to make those necessary staffing, process, and automation changes is often a tough battle, right? So today we see that general counsel and legal departments, compliance leaders, even internal investigation functions collectively face performance pressures as to value, speed, cost, and execution within compliance requirements. Right? It's a massively complex regulatory environment that they have to operate in. So we're going to talk a little bit about how, while investigatory underperformance doesn't create significant liability all the time, there are plenty of cases where, and we'll get into some of them, where there is massive impact, like the bank story. So unification isn't the single sort of end-all be-all. It's not the silver bullet that's going to solve everything from to eliminate risk or to liability. But it is a key building block, that unification, because boards, executives, clients and customers even, and shareholders, right? The awareness amongst people outside the organization, including regulators and other stakeholders, is constantly going up. And there's an expectation they have of company executives who run these functions to say, have you established a standardized process? Have you factored in your compliance and regulatory requirements? If you haven't, then you're sort of failing to meet expectations. So those are the expectations really that form the basis of what we're going to get into today around standardization, communicating value, and simplifying and automating investigation processes. So why don't we jump into that? Maybe we go to the next slide on standardization. So our first point we said we'd begin with is around standardization. And before any investigative work starts, I think what we start with is aligning with executive priorities when we're setting and communicating our investigative priorities. And the purpose is to make sure that our investigations support organizational goals, which in turn translate into a value proposition, which we'll spend a bit of time on talking about in just a little bit. Now, I'm not saying ignore stuff that negatively impacts your strategies and priorities. Rather, what we're getting at is, how do you consider organizational priorities when you're assessing allegations and investigations? So if growth is a priority for your business, then prioritize allegations that may derail growth objectives. For example, allegations about channel stuffing or fake sales may be weighted higher than other allegations. And you can start having these consistent sort of priorities and focuses when you have some standardization around your process. That standardization doesn't just support the business objectives, but it also helps mitigate risk. How? Well, when everyone has visibility to the process, how you get from point A to B, you reduce inconsistencies and compliance issues because local regulatory and other considerations are baked into the process, and everyone can see where unique and steps are required. For example, in Germany, you can follow a standard global investigation process, but that include notifications about works councils that you may have to make sure happen. The standardization also reduces risk from legal challenges. Right? We're all going to face litigation in certain cases and certain investigations. If they're based on often inconsistencies, missteps, or other errors, it's going to weaken your position and potentially create other liability. So standardization also helps in that sense. And then last but not least, everyone's under pressure to perform better. Right? I talked about the pit crew example. It's like, are you fast? Are you efficient? Are you effective? So standardization helps you with your global team. Right? When you've got a unified process, it allows investigators to collaborate on, across regions, which also facilitates load balancing and resource leveraging, which makes you more responsive to the business. Right? And you can get substantially greater geographic coverage with your existing team. So all of these things, Danish, I think, go to the value proposition of corporate investigations. And we can talk about some examples of what we've seen. Matt or Danish, I don't know if you have any other comments to add to that.
I guess the only thing I'd say quickly is perhaps an obvious point, but it's often the case that the rigor and the sort of systemic approach to these problems comes in the wake of a crisis in the business or in the wake of an event in the world. Certainly that's always going to be true, and it's necessary to be appropriately reactive, but it's a whole lot easier if you get ahead of it. I've been around long enough now that just during this part of my career, there have been 3 pretty major economic resets. I was actually in the Lehman Brothers office making a pitch when people started throwing chairs out the door and packing things in boxes and whatnot. Tyco was a customer when Tyco had a few problems. I was in Morgan Stanley only months after they had a little bit of a discovery blip when they were sort of systemically trying to make sure they captured those issues, and we were not in those particular cases selling them something that probably would have been even more fit to purpose, which is a bespoke investigation solution, but instead just standing up matter management and systemic ways of capturing cases once they became cases. And so I think there's the whole idea of getting ahead of the risk as much as possible
Yeah.
is super important.
Right, I think I typically see this whole sort of tension between the proactive and reactive, right? I mean, which is more painful, and that's where I think you're going to cover this. That ROI question comes into mind. Like, I mean, how easy is it, or how painful is it to even kind of go chase that proactive state, or otherwise, benchmark after benchmark, we see like, oh, top 3, we could be better. Like it's not just sort of a mantra that, oh yeah, everybody can be better, but it's like coming from a place of true pain. Like, I mean, if you go in deeper, say, hey, what do you mean you can be better? It'd be like, oh, we can be way better than we are today. So I think that's a true pain.
I think we there's a couple of examples. One of the things that we want to do on this webinar is make sure that we don't just talk about things in isolation, and that we wanted to share some examples and make sure that we're demonstrating that this is real, and these things have been repeated over time, and unfortunately or fortunately, depending on what side you sit on, they will continue to be repeated. So here are a couple of examples that maybe we'll chat through here. Much like the bank story that we mentioned, the first of these two examples provides a cautionary tale of how disjointed or siloed practices across a global conglomerate allowed illegal activities to persist for years. In the mid-2000s, there was a German-based multinational. It's one of the world's biggest engineering companies, and they faced a corruption scandal involving bribery and illegal payments across multiple countries. Now, in some regions with high corruption risk, cultural norms and competitive pressures were key to contributing to an environment where bribery was seen by local teams as simply the cost of doing business. The bribes occurred for more than 10 years, and when investigators really later tallied them up, they'd paid out over $1 billion in bribes across multiple divisions. Now, as the dust settled, they ultimately paid out a $1.6 billion settlement. Many of their top executives, including the CEO and even some board members, were resigned or forced out. And many factors contributed to why this persisted under the radar for so long. There were siloed structures, there were cultural norms, there were ineffective internal audits, there were sort of the way incentives are structured. But one of the keys that was found behind this is that there was a lack of unified compliance and investigation function. The process, there wasn't a single process that could really gather early warning signs, analyze financial and other data, and encourage employees to speak up. Those were all also key contributors to this. So that's something to think about, and probably something we'll see again.
I know there's a lot of focus put on, like you mentioned, the speak up programs, the ethics hotlines, and a lot of tactical stuff. But then we typically find everything is very decentralized. Matt, again, I think you mentioned some of the larger organizations as well. What are you seeing in sort of these decentralized organizations? What keeps them, or what's sort of the pain point out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately a cultural thing, and just the way that you described, Mirat. I mean, certainly, Enron had one kind of culture, and I think the corporate culture is much more focused on ethics and compliance than ever today. I guess in some ways, what makes some of these events difficult is that it's sort of happening everywhere all at once. One of our big pharma customers was having a number of talc claims made against it, so literally thousands a day all around the world for what went on for over a year. And so they decided to come up with a way of really trapping these things in the field, including allowing customers to make direct complaints to them, and where they would meet with a representative of the pharma out in the field. They were taking pictures of the claim documents and sort of documenting it, and then they connected that to WhatsApp, and they connected WhatsApp to Onit, so that we had just complete touch point all the way out into the market. We had another big box company that was using our solution to actually put it at the field retail level. The store manager could say someone just slipped and fell in the parking lot, and some of these are as benign as those kinds of generic claims, and sometimes it's a sometimes spurious set of recurring claims against the company. And I think it's sort of the opposite of the silos is when there's already a corporate culture to be sure that this is being that you're doing well by the customer, and that you're capturing this information and dealing with it in a systemic way. And I've seen the opposite, obviously, with the silos, where the one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. But it's a beautiful thing when there actually is a culture that invites that kind of service to their underlying customer and wants to proactively deal with it. And the companies that do that come out way ahead. All the way back when I was a pup in private practice, I did my first legal work in the John Mansville bankruptcy, which came out of asbestos, and so there was the ultimate example of mass tort. And the companies that did a good job of gathering that information, being responsive to the claimants, being responsive even to the government entities that were coming in, came out reasonably well. Those who dragged their feet ended up sometimes going out of business. And not trying to be dramatic here, but it really is a cultural choice to get ahead of this from the top down.
We still talk about this in e-discovery town. Like, we're generating petabytes and petabytes. Everything is generating data. So if we're not necessarily paying attention to it, all of this gets captured somewhere. So I guess when we talk about we didn't know, it is becoming not a real good defense anymore. We've given examples. We've had issues where new salespeople come in some remote country. Salespeople come in, they have to make their sales quota. They kind of do everything, but 5 years later, there's like a fraud inquiry or like a bribery inquiry going on, and then you can't just say, oh, because we had new people coming in, they were not up to speed, or we just did the training. In many of those cases, I mean, the governments have really cracked down and had an effect on the business. So back to you, Mirat. I mean, I think these are great observations in the market that things are happening, just letting them be undetected.
No, it's not. And your data point reminds me of a story I'll share. And it's actually similar to the sort of retail example that we have as a second one, where the key was sort of this fragmentation, and they didn't have a single source to really get a view of the complete picture. But there was a client we're working with, large global company, and had acquired a number of businesses in emerging markets. And some of the folks managing the emerging markets had gotten sense that, hey, we've got to get these, we've got to comply now with the FCPA, and with it was almost like a pre-investigative, sort of getting ahead of things, investigation type of work. And when we got there, they said, oh, no, we realize that we've got to do this. And so we've been tracking all the bribes that the salespeople are playing, and we're making sure that they're continuing to go down. And we're just looking at this like, oh my God, like the point is zero, not that you're tracking the trend. You've now got a spreadsheet that lays out, like, by salesperson, bribes they're paying still. So well-intended in the sense that they had gotten the message, but somewhere in the communication, that was an easy investigative outcome. It was right there. It's like we were able to sort of get ahead of it and put a stop to it. But still, that's the kind of data and trends that you can't then get away with these days, because as you said, Danish, it's sitting out there, and it's going to get discovered. But let's based on that maybe move on to our second point: is how do we start getting some money to help you drive change, right? And so what we want to really focus on is communicating a value and to drive the securing investment. So by this time, hopefully everyone's in agreement that unification is essential. It really brings everything together to form a complete picture. It provides streamlines operations, it's speed, it provides resource leveraging. It really helps drive value to the business. So we mentioned that securing is difficult, and Matt mentioned that you could simply wait for a disaster to happen, because funding becomes readily available when something really bad happens. But we all know that that's really not leadership, and it really doesn't align with the ethical responsibilities that we all have. So let's talk about how we might get started. And by the way, as I talk about this, the irony that unification makes it easier to create a business case, but that you need a business case for investment in unification is not lost on me. There's definitely a little bit of a chicken and the egg challenge that everyone has, but there are some creative ways on how to actually solve it, and we'll start talking about some of them. So when we think about quantifying a value proposition, I think what may be surprising on this list, as we think about these specific bullets around revenue, cost, protection, compliance, is the word revenue that's in there. So I figured let's start there. Now, we're not suggesting that risk, compliance, investigation functions are going to start generating revenue, but they can contribute to or impact revenue generation. So think about it. When companies lose contracts or clients, when they're restricted in certain markets or they're limited in what they can sell, all of those things have significant revenue impact. So we've worked with clients to use past incidents or examples from similar companies to establish a basis for estimating what that revenue impact might look like. You can bring in fines, litigation costs, because they also reduce funds available for things like marketing or R&D or digital innovation. All of these things that generate revenue and that you need to stay competitive. Now, cost generally is a simpler one for people to think through. We've already discussed some of the costs of investigation failures, tens or hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. But there are other cost impacts that can come from, you need to hire more and more people when things aren't managed very well. Your investigation timeframes, get longer and longer if you don't have the right resources. And then are you appropriately managing other spend, whether it's outside counsel spend, investigator spend, or anything else? Is that being managed? So a lot of things can help think about the impact that standardization and automation can help in terms of painting a picture and being more efficient. But we also want to talk about protection, and this is about building a full business case. So protection of assets, intellectual property theft, right? Market and competitive impact that can generate. If these patterns of theft or go undetected or under or uninvestigated, are you really fully protecting the assets that you're effectively charged with protecting? And what I find is for compliance functions, for investigation functions, the compliance part is pretty straightforward, right? There's fines and penalties that we've talked about, but then you've got things that you can think about beyond that. I think about what happens when you have major repeated lapses. How does that erode the brand? Can that turn customers off? Is that going to regulate, regulate regulatory scrutiny? And then how long is it going to take to build trust back? It could take years. It could take lots of money. And in some cases, some organizations never recover from that sort of erosive effect of loss and brand reputation. So whenever we work with clients, and as anyone here is thinking about it, as you quantify it, think about all 4 areas, right? Use analytics, market comparisons. You need evidence-based insights when you go and present your business case. And maybe this is obvious, but once you have it all packaged up, a part to consider is that whole objective thing. Think about where the company's focused. What are the things that are going to matter most? If the company's really focused on revenue growth in specific markets, then maybe that's what you emphasize a little bit more. What's the impact on sales in that market? What about customers or innovation or revenue? I think all of those things help tailor the message. And the other thing that we often see is that people create this message and then they blast it out to all the key stakeholders. But there's an art to that as well. It's almost like a sales pitch, and I want to get Matt's input on this in a second. But if you're talking to the CEO about getting investment, well, his or her priorities are going to be different than the CFO's, and the CFO's are going to be different than the chief compliance officer. So once you've got that full picture, really tailoring it to different audiences will help drive that value proposition. Matt, I sort of threw you in there, but I was wondering what your sense is on when you've got that value proposition and communicating it out there.
Yeah, in my experience, the further the conversations I've had, and I'm going to embrace your suggestion about the sales cycle instead of building the business case, the further up the food chain they go, the more it's about brand protection and surprise avoidance. And so I can remember a lot of conversations with general counsel when, in the course of doing the due diligence on either an early part of an engagement or even in a sales cycle, I'd start asking general counsel about the reports that matter most to her or to him. And something would come out of the corner of the desk, if you will. And I can remember one consumer goods company where they said, well, we have this brand claim problem that we want to solve. Right now we're doing it in Lotus Notes and spreadsheets and gathering up this information very manually around the world. This company did business in over 90 different countries. And so I got a little education on brand protection, whereby there is a process if another company makes a claim against your product, or even on behalf of their own, how many doctors recommend X or Y toothpaste. There's a way, if those are just afactual, to make challenges to it. But in order to do so, you have to do so in a very timely fashion. And so there was this very manual process by which the brand claim inventory got collected up to the general counsel. And in part, this was just the general counsel being a good officer of this information. And in part, it was because the general counsel did not want to go in front of the CEO or the board and being asked, well, have you seen that kind of thing coming out of China or Russia or Chile or wherever the claim might have been made against their product or on behalf of a competitor. And so, these things, even where they're not crises, are often very intimately connected to the brand. And so that was a chance for us to actually have a workflow very specific to brand. But at the end of the day, any challenge to the behaviors or product of your company, you want to get ahead of it. You want to get ahead of it in a systemic way. So I've seen that often these processes exist, but they're very manual in terms of how the way the information is gathered, and sort of one manual baton pass to another in order to achieve the ultimate executive report. But those executive reports are hugely important to those officers for all the right reasons in terms of their own connections.
That's some great background, Matt. Thanks very much. And I think Danish, we've got a couple of examples on the next page, but it's interesting. When we think about this, and we're going to get into a little bit more depth, even more narrowly on investigations in terms of things like investigation reports and investigation plans. and how automation helps drive those and helps with the value proposition, but also helps from a de-risking standpoint. But I did want to mention this first example on this page because it echoes into where you were going as well, Matt. This was a company that I think did a particularly good job of coming up with their business case. It was an international financial institution, and compliance leaders there. I should say compliance and investigation leaders, because it was a team effort. Really needed to drive some change. And so they built a pretty compelling business case to secure investment. And interestingly enough, when they built that business case, they hit on all four of the value proposition points that we discussed. They hit on compliance by focusing on previous fines and settlements. They emphasized what failing to invest in compliance could lead to. They tracked share price performance dips. They looked out for market data. They looked for brand perception shifts. I mean, it was a pretty thorough, analysis to bring into a compliance perspective. But luckily, they didn't stop there. They looked at cost. And then we mentioned this earlier. Said you could either pay now or pay later. And that's sort of how they positioned it to the board that they were going to present to, in addition to the C-suite. They compared the cost of what it would take to have a proactive compliance and investigation process and function in terms of legal fees and fines and what it would cost to remediate. They built data-driven models to sort of forecast exposures on potential fines in high-risk jurisdictions and legal defense costs. And they really wanted to show the board how $1 spent on compliance could reduce future risk events and what that meant. But like I said, they hit on all four. So revenue was in there too. They looked at this, they looked at the market, and they said, hey, positioning this as a stronger compliance program is a strategic advantage. And this gets back to my little F1 example that I started with. A strong pit crew is key to business performance. A strong pit crew is a key to whether that driver is going to win or lose a race. And so their corporate and institutional clients in this case, they said, we're increasingly preferring banks with robust reputation for integrity, that we're able to demonstrate being able to catch potential issues and investigate and report on them properly. And that also, because they were tracking, it enabled more accurate tracking of where issues were coming up, where were incidents coming up, what was the root cause. They were able to get more proactive in going back and fixing, whether it's controls or training or hiring practices or any combination thereof. And so it really helped strengthen the compliance and investigation process. And so much so that they believed in this, that they actually went back to the business and say, hey, how does this impact your sales pitch? Is this something you can incorporate into your sales pitch? And of course, the folks in the business who are responsible for sales said yes, and they took that message back to the board as well. So they really kind of hit on every aspect of the 4 points that we talked about. And it's not so much I want to say that everyone has to, but a lot of times when we raise this, people say, oh yeah, but no one's going to buy into it, or it's not really possible. And I just wanted to share an example here of where we've seen it work, and that it really is possible.
Great example. And this was investigations is very serious stuff, and we talk about it. But this is the exciting part, that Mirat, Matt, our teams are able to help you, for the listeners and the attendees, put that map together. You don't have to do it alone, right? That's the most challenging part. If you're a GC or if you're even a board member, and trying to figure out what's the safest path through, right? Don't do it alone. There are teams out there, there are folks that can help you.
Yep.
So I will give my panel a 10-minute check. Let's do a 10-minute we have a couple of more points, and then at the end with some exciting news of how to kind of interact with us a little bit more for folks who would stick around for another 10 minutes. So, and then we'll just take some comments.
I think we wanted to set the stage properly. Is it realistic to really simplify down to one common global process? Now, if I said no, then it would be kind of silly and funny. But the answer is, of course, yes. And when we've worked with clients, we time and time again, we hear about how different teams in different regions or countries can't follow a uniform process because they've got a different regulatory requirement, they've got other local requirements and restrictions, and whenever we end up working with them, in reality, what we found is probably about 90% of a global investigation process is probably reasonably identical. And so if you have a well-designed process, you have all your standard elements that are common steps, but then you also incorporate right into that exception handling for any local requirements. So it can be done. And when you enable that through something like Onit, it adds speed and simplification. And I said earlier, we'll talk about investigation plans and reports, but here's an example where the process and the technology all start coming together. Right? So, for example, you could have standard templates for an investigation plan and for investigation reports. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, well, we have templates. And what they often find is that they have templates, but people start modifying them slightly or taking a slightly different angle on them or prioritizing different parts or making local modifications. And all of a sudden, over time, they're not so standard. So having this in a platform helps reduce that variability, but that reduced variability also has a benefit of reducing editing time and review time, right? And then you can have these templates pre-populated with content that you've already produced, right? So things that you've already gotten, like the routine stuff like case number and who's the subject, who's the reporting party, et cetera, witnesses, all of that stuff can be pre-filled as you're doing as you're getting into the report side. But any summaries or analyses that have been done, those can also be pulled in. But that's not it. You could take templates and have multiple templates. So in some cases, what we've done is said, hey, you've got some cases that are pretty simple to investigate. They're pretty common processes that you follow. So why don't we just standardize some of the language? So, for example, on the investigation approach, or how we're going to handle evidence, or what kind of data are we going to request, right? We can pre-fill those. Now, that doesn't mean the investigator can't edit the content that we've pre-filled, but because it's pre-filled, they're modifying it and tailoring it to the investigation as opposed to having to draft it all anew. And that also drives consistency from a review standpoint. So you end up simplifying and speeding investigations, but at the same time, you reduce a lot of the risk and you increase consistency. The other thing is about data. So if you're managing an investigation function, allocating your resources across that function become key. How are you going to make, for example, investigation assignments? Right? Now you've got much more visibility into what the different workload is. And you can look at workload based on the types of investigation, the complexity, historically, the number of hours that have gone into different categories. You start making much smarter decisions through various dashboards that get put in place to help manage that workload. And then if you want to consider softer things like, hey, we know that XYZ people have worked on these types, but you can extend that even further and say, I know that so-and-so is actually interested in building a skill set around this area. So when it's all there in front of you, you can make much smarter resource allocation decisions that also engage and develop the team. Right? Now, on a global basis, workloads are going to vary across countries, across regions over time. And they're going to vary based on calendar year, or the time in the calendar. In some cases, companies see spikes in allegations of misconduct, as review cycles come around. And so you can start seeing those trends, you can start planning for those trends, and you can also start weighing I'm not saying that the allegations that come in and those are all wrong, but that may be something that goes into the consideration as you're trying to prioritize workloads. So that's something else to consider. And last but not least, when it's centralized and you've got access to local investigations and local requirements, you can repurpose investigators across borders. Now, it's not always true because there are regulatory considerations, and we'll factor those in. But it really helps balance that, and it creates assurance and comfort on your end that investigations, data, evidence is all being compliant with geographic limitations in terms of how it's being shared, how it's being viewed, et cetera. So there's a lot of benefits ultimately that it comes with that sort of simplification and automation, right? And I'm not going to try to get into the whole plan. I think that there's a lot of points on this screen. I think the keys to focus on is really engage your teams, make them part of the change. It makes it easier. You'll get a better sense of what's out there. You'll actually be surprised in some cases to what you'll find in terms of tools and enablers and things that people have built, and being able to bring them all back together and so that you can unify access to all that information, can provide tremendous value. And they'll feel valued because their stuff is being used and they're being part of the process. So I think that becomes key. Recognizing what those requirements are in terms of what's actually required versus stuff that I really want to have, or that I'm just saying, yeah, but that's the way we've always done it. It's like, okay, but have you always done it that way because you have to, or because that's just how you've gotten comfortable? So really starting to discern between those two, and also not approaching this on a sequential basis, right? We talked about speed. Danish, you talked about making sure that I've got an F1 approach to this, and so we know time is precious, and so you can, when you've got a platform like we've worked with Onit, where you've already got a starting point from an investigations platform, what you can start doing is gathering your needs while you're starting to build out certain things in Onit, because you'll be surprised that not only are things reasonably common within an organization, but when you look across organizations, people aren't radically reinventing how investigations are done. So the platform there can help serve as a guide. I'm not saying it shouldn't be tailored, it should be, but tailoring something versus building something new is a whole different ballgame. So I'll pause there, and I think a lot of these things can really help, sort of protect your environment, preserve.
I wanted, sorry, but I just wanted Matt's thought on this one, and then I think we're coming to the time, and
Sure.
I'll take your comments and closing comments on this. Matt, any thoughts on this from your standpoint? I think Mirat's done a good job in sort of taking us through how do we build a ROI, how do we sort of put it into practice, and we're going to have a series of these webinars into taking next steps as well. So that's why we're not going to spend too much time on this. But your thoughts on looking at this?
Yeah, I would just make this one last point about timeline. Because the solution, especially in Swiftwater's hands with its experience, is so substantially configured out of the box, you can do the first stage of this relatively quickly. And of course, for your industry, for your company to reflect the practices and honor the practices of people who are already doing this work, there's configuration that's involved. But as we have to make sure that we don't conflate the enormous impact that this can have and the importance to the company with some sort of heavy iron SAP style implementation. It is not that. And so the timeline, I don't want to be cavalier about it, but it's certainly measured in weeks and months and not, parts of a year. In terms of getting from the beginning to where you're already driving some value. So that's exciting for me, is to see that we're at a stage where we can do this relatively efficiently for our customers.
Great. No, thank you very much. So maybe just kind of parting comments. What is our sort of one guiding point? Matt, I like your point about technology and process doesn't have to be like a year's worth of thing. I mean, start where you can, and then you have this is our exciting part of our partnership as well. You've got tools that can get you started, and you sort of build your pyramid on top of it for continuous improvement. Mirat, Matt, last 30 seconds, tell us.
My one thing is that I think that is something we started with is that boards, customers, regulators, they expect you to drive towards standardization. The market expects you to drive towards efficiency, and every part of the organization is a player. And I think what we've talked about here today is a path to get there.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think my only observation is that one of the things I've seen this cycle swing from pre-Enron to post-Enron when there was a separation of the compliance and the law department by my observation. Now I see these things coming back together, and it's just a great opportunity for team play within your organization, between your compliance team. Maybe there is already a separate investigations team, the law department, the business. It's just something that lends itself to team play, and that just makes these projects very exciting to be a part of.
Exciting. Well, thank you very much for the panel and for all the folks who had joined us today. Don't forget to register for our next upcoming sessions. If you need any information, you've got 3 email addresses. You can come back to this LinkedIn. This would be available, or reach out to anybody on the Swiftwater or the Onit team. There's a lot on the website. There's a lot more to come on this. We're excited. And more importantly, if you want to look at the demo of how this process and technology and all of what we talked about is just not a figment of our imagination, this is real life stuff that you can touch and feel. And we are very excited about bringing it to the market along with the folks that are already sort of jumping on the bandwagon.
Take care. Thank you.
Stay tuned for more. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Folks. Bye.